to bring those creations to life?
I've been a refrigeration technician for over 20 years, and even though I've worked in hundreds of different places, I've always lived in the same quiet town in the northern US, Clearfield. I grew up in a modest home, raised by a father who taught me from an early age that respecting the dead was sacred. I was never afraid of cemeteries. In fact, for many years, I saw them as peaceful spaces, places where one could think without interruption. That's how I used to think, until that Sunday. A Sunday that, even though more than 5 years have passed, still haunts my nights. And the worst part, it didn't happen only to me. That day, like I did every 2 or 3 weeks, I got up early. I prepared a bottle of water, a stiff bristled brush, a clean rag, and some flowers I had bought the day before at the downtown farmers market. I decided to walk to the city cemetery, where my father, Mr. Arthur, had been buried for over a decade after suffering heart complications. It was my way of still talking to him, of feeling close, even in silence. I left the house before 7. The sky was clear, the air cool, and the neighborhood was still asleep. I walked a few blocks until I reached the cemetery's main gate, already open. Mr. Thomas, the same caretaker as always, greeted me with a nod as he swept the entrance. I nodded back and continued walking through the narrow paths between graves. My father's grave was at the very back, in an older section that hardly anyone visits. The headstones there were worn, many faded, some without names. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant chirping of a bird. I knelt by Mr. Arthur's grave and started clearing away dry leaves, scrubbing the stone gently. I felt a strange kind of peace. It wasn't sadness, it was more like companionship. That's when something shifted. At first, it was a faint creak, then footsteps, slow, dragging. I raised my head, sure someone was approaching, but no one was there. I looked down again, thinking it was just the wind, but the footsteps continued, closer now, more distinct. And then I saw her, an older woman, hair tied back, wearing a pale dress, calmly walking along a side path. She wasn't carrying flowers or anything at all. She was simply walking. As she passed by, she paused for a moment, looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Good morning, son." I replied out of politeness, but inside something tightened. Something in her voice, in her stare, chilled my gut in a way I couldn't explain. If you're drawn to stories like this, make sure to subscribe, tap the bell icon, and share in the comments your own most haunting life experience, because what happened that day was only the beginning. I watched the woman as she slowly faded between the graves. Her steps were soft, almost floating, as if she weren't really touching the ground. She didn't look back, nor did she seem in a hurry to reach anywhere. It struck me as strange that she was alone at that hour in such a distant part of the cemetery. But what disturbed me even more was that when I glanced back just a few seconds later, she was gone, vanished as though she had dissolved between the tombstones. I stood up, unsettled. Maybe she'd turned down one of the side paths. Maybe. But when you grow up in a small town like Clearfield, you know every inch of it. And I knew for a fact there was no quick way out in that direction. I clenched the rag in my damp hands and looked around again. The air no longer felt crisp. Something had shifted. A denser, heavier silence had settled over everything. Then I heard another sound, this time clearer, closer, like someone brushing earth with their feet. I looked toward a grave a few yards away and felt my blood freeze. An older man with a pale face and sunken eyes was rising slowly from the ground. He wasn't climbing out of an open grave, no. He was simply there on his knees, getting up like someone waking from a long sleep. His clothes were old-fashioned, worn, but clean. He straightened his jacket with care, looked around, and started to walk slowly. Before I could react, 2 others appeared behind him. They were younger, calm-looking, but just the same, they emerged from the earth without any explanation. One had slicked-back hair and a neatly buttoned shirt. The other wore a light-colored jacket with a torn sleeve. I watched them frozen, my heart pounding hard against my chest. None of them seemed to notice me, until the young man in the jacket stopped, turned his head, and looked directly at me. There was no hate in his eyes, no warmth either, just a hollow expression as if he weren't fully there. But something in that look cut right through me. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, not even close my eyes. I wanted to believe I was dreaming. But it wasn't a dream. I knew because I could feel the sun's heat, the sweat on my back, the scent of damp earth and dried flowers. Everything was too vivid, too real. The woman in the pale dress stopped 3 graves away from me. She knelt as if to pray and stayed perfectly still. The others began to spread out. Some wandered aimlessly among the tombs. Others stood silently in front of headstones, gazing at them. My breath was shallow, my fingers trembling, and my mind grasping for logic. But there was none. This was happening. I was there, and so were they. I felt trapped in a moment outside of time. The figures rising from the ground didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't interact with one another. They simply moved, slowly. Some stopped at graves they seemed to recognize. Others wandered the paths like they were searching for something they'd left behind. One of them, a heavy-set man with a thin mustache and a grey suit, crouched by a broken wooden cross. He brushed his hand across it as if dusting off years of time. Another, dark-skinned and wearing a worn-out straw hat, sat on a concrete bench and stared into the horizon without blinking. Everything happened in silence. There was no breeze, no bird song, not even the usual buzz of insects in that part of the cemetery. Just them, moving as though they still had unfinished business. The woman in the pale dress remained kneeling, head bowed. Her body didn't move, but her lips seemed to whisper something, perhaps a prayer. I thought I heard her voice, just a faint murmur, but I couldn't make out a single word. It was a sound unlike anything I'd heard before. My mind scrambled for answers. I thought maybe it was some kind of theatrical performance, a strange religious ritual. But there were no spectators, no organizers, no explanation. I was alone. Completely alone in the middle of something I shouldn't have been witnessing. The young man in the jacket was still watching me, not with menace, but with something like recognition. As if he knew I could see him. As if, out of all of them, he alone was aware of my presence. I clung to the cross on my father's grave. I needed something solid, something to remind me I still belonged to this world. And then, as if an invisible veil had lifted, everything began to fade. First the woman. She slowly blurred until she vanished. Then the others began to disappear too. They didn't run, didn't flee. They simply faded one by one like shadows erased by the sun. And just as the last of them vanished, I heard voices, real voices, regular footsteps, conversations. A group of people entered through the side path, carrying flowers, water bottles, gardening tools, ordinary visitors, just like I had been a few minutes earlier. Everything had returned to normal. Birds were singing again, the breeze gently stirred the leaves, and the scent of soil and dried foliage settled back into its usual place. I looked toward the spot where everything had happened. Just old graves, weeds growing between cracked stones, and a couple of crows perched on a rusted cross. I knelt down in silence. My legs were shaking. Sweat slid down my back. An older woman walked by and stopped near me. She asked if I was okay. I nodded. I couldn't speak. How do you explain something that shouldn't exist? When I finally managed to collect myself, I gathered my things without much thought. I left the flowers beside the grave, forgot the brush, and walked toward the exit with unsteady steps. Every time I glanced back, I half expected to see them again. But there was no one. Just crooked crosses, dry branches, and the morning sun warming the cracked cement. When I reached the front gate, Mr. Thomas was there. He was a weathered man, thin, always wearing a dark cap pulled low over his forehead. I'd known him by sight since I was a boy. He had always been the cemetery's caretaker, a quiet, serious man who rarely spoke to anyone. He was lighting a cigarette when he noticed me. He looked straight at me, squinting slightly, then slowly exhaled a stream of smoke. "I saw what you saw," he said without hesitation, as if we were talking about a sudden rainstorm we'd both been caught in. I froze. The cigarette trembled just slightly between his fingers, but his face wasn't afraid. It was something else. Something older. As if this scene had played out before. "Come again?" I asked, barely finding my voice. "I saw it," he repeated, "and it's not the first time. Things happen here, but not to everyone. Only to those who come alone, with an open heart." I sat down on a concrete bench near the gate. My legs wouldn't cooperate, and my thoughts spun like leaves in a gust. Sweat rolled down my neck. Mr. Thomas sat on the low wall beside me, never taking his eyes off the cemetery. "I've worked here for 23 years, he continued. "I've seen people run out screaming, kids claiming they talk to headstones with no names. But when the dead walk, that's different." His tone was firm, almost resigned. He spoke of other cases, not naming names, but sharing details that made my blood run cold. A woman who fainted after seeing her dead husband sitting by his grave. A man who returned every Sunday for months, claiming his deceased mother still spoke to him. Then I told him about the woman who greeted me. Mr. Thomas lowered his eyes and took a moment before answering. "That was Mrs. Ellen. She used to come every Sunday, same time. Her son died in a bus crash. She never missed a visit, until one morning like this, she collapsed near the far corner. Heart attack. We buried her that same Monday." I stared at him, stunned. "But she spoke to me." "I know," he said without surprise. "She's been seen before, but she spoke to you." My stomach twisted, my eyes burned. This wasn't suggestion, it wasn't imagination. It was real. I saw her, she saw me, and she was dead. That night I couldn't sleep. I went to bed early, but I didn't close my eyes. Every time I tried, the image of the young man in the light jacket returned. His stare was still fixed, like he hadn't stopped watching me from some dark corner. When exhaustion finally took over, I fell into a heavy sleep, and what I experienced in that dream left me even more drained by morning. I was in the same cemetery path. It was night, no moon. The graves were shrouded in darkness, but I recognized them by shape, by the air, by the scent. Then came the footsteps, slow, dragging, the exact same sound I'd heard that morning. They came from deep inside. I stood still, unable to move. Someone whispered my name. No shouting, no crying. Just my name, spoken with sorrow. I woke up drenched in sweat, sat up in bed, turned on the lamp, and sat there hunched forward listening to the silence. It wasn't normal. The silence in my house had never bothered me. But that night, it weighed heavy, like I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the night with the TV on. The sound gave me comfort, but not fully. At 3:15 a.m., while trying to keep my eyes open, I heard it again. A whisper from the kitchen, my name, soft, like someone calling me through a thin wall. I stood carefully, as if moving too quickly might startle something. I walked toward the kitchen. The light was off. I didn't dare turn it on. I looked around. Nothing. No one. But the smell, that damned smell, of damp earth, rotting flowers, and spent candles, the exact same scent from the cemetery's old section. I stood motionless, not even breathing, until the smell faded. I returned to the living room, sat on the couch and stared at the screen. I don't remember falling asleep, but the next morning, when my daughter came by to bring me bread and the paper, she noticed something different. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, seeing my wrinkled shirt, the bags under my eyes and the redness. I tried to say something, to tell her what had happened, but seeing her face, a mix of concern and doubt, I stayed quiet. I didn't want pity. I wasn't looking for explanations. I just wanted peace. And that was what I lacked the most. Days passed, but the atmosphere in the house didn't change. At night I heard footsteps in the hallway. During the day, I felt eyes on my back. Sometimes, when passing the bathroom mirror, I thought I saw a shadow behind me. But when I turned, nothing was there. This wasn't fear of the afterlife. It was the certainty that something from there had come back with me. On Thursday night, after 4 nights of unrest, I made a decision. I pulled out the Old Town phone book and looked up the number for the city cemetery. I didn't know if anyone would answer at that hour, but I needed answers. I called, and to my surprise, a familiar voice answered, "Mr. Thomas." "Hello?" he said in his usual calm tone. "It's me, the one who was there on Sunday," I replied. There was a brief silence. Then he asked directly, "Have they come back to visit?" I don't know how he knew, but he knew. I stayed quiet for a moment before answering. "Yes, not every night, but they're here. I feel them." He sighed as if my confirmation was something he had expected. "Sometimes it happens," he said. "They don't mean harm. They just want to be remembered." "Why me?" I asked, throat dry. "Because you saw them," he answered firmly. "Most people see nothing. They live in denial, in avoidance, but you look them in the eye. That creates a bond." I sat in silence. What he said made sense, even if it was terrifying. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't some demonic possession like in the movies. It was something more human, deeper, as if those souls had simply found someone who recognized them, someone who didn't look away. And that bond, can it be broken? "Sometimes it fades on its own," he said. "Other times, the cycle has to be closed. It depends on what was opened, depends on them, and on you." We ended the call with a brief exchange of words. He thanked me for not hanging up, for not mocking him. And I thanked him for answering, for not treating me like I was insane. That night I didn't sleep, not from fear, but because something inside me kept turning over and over. What had they seen in me? Why had they chosen me? And more importantly, what did they expect me to do? The next day, I noticed something new. In the dining room on the table, there was a wilted flower, an old daisy, the kind that grows between graves, wild and unplanted. There was no wind, no windows open. No one else had been there. I picked it up between my fingers and walked out to the backyard. I didn't know if I should leave it, burn it, or bury it. In the end, I just let it fall to the ground and walked away. All through that Friday, I had the constant feeling that someone was walking behind me, but it was no longer the paralyzing fear. It was something else, a kind of persistent discomfort, like someone was waiting for something from me. That's when I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't enough to endure. I had to act. I had to find a way to understand, and maybe to set them free. On Saturday, just after noon, I walked to the church in the neighborhood. I didn't go often, but I remembered Father Julian, a quiet, older man with a calm gaze and a gentle voice, who had been serving at St. Benedict's Parish for decades. He wasn't the kind to deliver fiery sermons or preach about miracles. He listened more than he spoke, and that was exactly what I needed. I entered through the sacristy, where I knew he usually spent his time at that hour. When he saw me, he lifted his eyes from the small book he was reading and greeted me with a slight nod. I didn't say anything at first. I simply sat across from him and looked him in the eye. "Father, I need to tell you something," I murmured. He closed the book, rested his elbows on the table, and waited in silence. I told him everything. From the Sunday at the cemetery to the sleepless nights, every detail, the voices, the footsteps, the face of the young man in the light jacket, the wilted flower on the table. I held nothing back. I spoke as if it were the last time I'd ever talk about it, with the desperate need to release something pressing against my chest. He didn't interrupt. He didn't frown or look away. He just listened, completely silent, as if he already knew each part of what I was saying. When I finished, a few seconds passed before he spoke. He stood slowly, walked over to a low bookshelf, and pulled out a small, worn book. Its pages yellowed, its cover faded. He handed it to me without ceremony. You won't find prayers here to drive away spirits, he said, but you'll find words meant to strengthen those who carry burdens they never asked for. I took the book with trembling hands. I didn't open it. I just held it. So, I'm not losing my mind. He shook his head gently. No, son, what you saw isn't madness, and it's not a punishment, it's a calling. A calling to remember, he replied. There are dead who don't rest because no one remembers them. Souls who died in silence, forgotten, and who sometimes return just to say, I existed. His words didn't scare me. They pierced through me with a calm I hadn't felt in days. He explained that some people, without meaning to, become bridges between the living and the ones who've passed. Not everyone has that sensitivity. Some are born with it, others develop it after a loss. You weren't chosen, he said at last. You were opened by the love for your father, by the respect with which you entered that cemetery. That's what they felt. I left the church in silence, the little book pressed to my chest. The sky was grey, the breeze gentle. I walked through the plaza with no clear direction, only one thought becoming clearer with each step. I had to go back, not to find more answers, but to give them one, and maybe to close that door. I didn't tell anyone what I planned to do, not my daughter, not my neighbors, not even Father Julian. I knew that if I spoke it out loud, they'd stop me, fill me with warnings, or worse, with doubts, and I couldn't afford to doubt. I had spent the entire week feeling something following me, like a quiet shadow breathing behind my neck. I had to return to the cemetery, not to confront anything, just to close. On Sunday, I got up before dawn. I dressed in clean clothes, took a white candle and a red rose I had left in water since Friday. I left home with firm steps, though inside, my hands were sweating like I carried an invisible weight around my neck. The cemetery gate was open, just like that other time. The town was still asleep and the silence wrapped around me like a heavy cloth. I didn't see Mr. Thomas, just the broom leaning against the wall, as if it too was waiting for me, though its owner remained unseen. I walked through paths I already knew, but everything felt different. There was no fear, only a tense calm. Like saying goodbye to someone, knowing you'll never see them again. I reached the back, where everything had begun. The old section, forgotten, where the names on the gravestones had faded and moss curled around the edges like a sorrowful touch. I knelt before an unmarked grave. I placed the rose on the stone and lit the candle. I didn't pray, I didn't plead, I just spoke. I haven't forgotten you, I said aloud. I saw you, and I know you saw me too. May God grant you peace. May someone remember you, even if that someone is me. A breeze blew at that moment, sudden, cool but not cold. The candle flickered, its flame danced for a second, then steadied. I felt a shiver rise from my feet to the back of my neck. But it wasn't fear. Not this time. It was something else. Something like a farewell. I stayed there for a few more minutes, silent, until the sun began to filter through the brittle branches beside the wall. I stood up slowly. As I turned to leave, I saw him. Mr. Thomas was leaning in the shade, arms crossed, his ever-present cap shading his forehead. As I passed by, he didn't say much. He just nodded toward the heart of the cemetery and murmured, "They know now. They'll let you be." I looked at him silently. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer promises. He simply stated, and for the first time in a long while, my chest felt just a bit lighter. It wasn't the end of everything, but yes, the beginning of a different kind of peace. I thought it was over then, that the lit candle and the flower on a forgotten grave would be enough to close the cycle. I walked toward the exit with a less tense body, as if the air no longer pressed down so heavily on my shoulders. But just before I crossed through the gate, Mr. Thomas called from the shadows, "Wait a second, there's something I never told you." I stopped. Something in his voice, that low but steady tone, made me turn without hesitation. We walked a few steps away from the gate, to a quiet corner, where only the rustling leaves could be heard. There, without looking directly at me, he began to speak. "Do you remember the woman who greeted you that Sunday?" I nodded. How could I forget? Her voice still echoed inside me every time I closed my eyes. Her name was Ellen Vargas. She used to come every Sunday without fail to visit her mother's grave. Always alone, always in the same pale dress you described. Until one morning, she collapsed right there in that far corridor. Massive heart attack. I was speechless, my stomach clenched like a fist. "She died 6 years ago," he continued. "Exactly on a Saturday afternoon, was buried that Monday, but the following Sunday, a young man came here swearing he saw her. Said she spoke to him, even smiled. No one believed him. Her daughter fainted when she heard his story." I looked at him. My throat tightened. I already knew what he was going to say. "You're not the first to see her, but you are the only one she ever greeted." I couldn't help but sit on the concrete bench by the wall. My legs were weak, my skin cold. Mr. Thomas remained standing, gazing into the cemetery. "Maybe she saw something in you," he added. "Or maybe she just wanted to be remembered. Sometimes, those who die suddenly take longer to accept they're gone, and they stay, they walk, they search." I rubbed my face with both hands, trying to make sense of it. Not seeking logic, but trying to accept a truth too heavy to deny. "And the others?" I asked. "The ones I saw rise from the graves. Do they have stories too?" He nodded slowly. "There are many here who left without goodbyes, with no one to pray for them, no names on their crosses. Death doesn't erase pain if no one remembers. Sometimes all they want is for someone to see them and know they once lived." I said nothing. I looked again at that field of graves as if each were a half-open door. And for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt reverence and a responsibility I hadn't asked for. But that now belonged to me. That day, I left changed. I didn't walk. I drifted quietly through the streets of Clearfield as if something had been torn from me and left me exposed before a truth I didn't know how to carry. I got home and closed the door gently, as though any noise might awaken something that had gone to sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the book Father Julian had given me still in my hands. I didn't open it. I just held it, feeling its weight. Outside, the sky was overcast, and the wind pushed the tree branches with a slowness that seemed to be telling a story older than the town itself. That night, I slept without unrest. For the first time in many days, I didn't dream of footsteps, shadows, or voices. I didn't feel watched. It was as if they all understood that I had done my part, that I had listened and remembered. Since then, I never set foot in another cemetery, not even when a distant uncle passed away. I offered my condolences, sent flowers, but didn't attend, not out of fear, out of reverence, because I understood that there are places where silence isn't emptiness, but memory, where every grave isn't just stone, but a story. Now every time I pass near a cemetery, I bow my head and whisper a short prayer, even if no one sees me, even if it seems like a meaningless gesture, because I know now that not all rest the same, and some are just waiting for someone, even just one person, to look at them with respect and say, even in thought, "I remember you." I never spoke to Mr. Thomas again, not because I didn't want to, simply because there was nothing left to say. He had already told me everything I needed, and I never shared this with anyone else, not with my daughter, not with Father Julian, not with a single friend, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I felt it wasn't something to be shared with just anyone, until now. I'm only writing this because in some way I know that you, the one listening, needed to hear it. Maybe because you've also felt that weight in your chest you couldn't explain. Maybe because you once passed through a sacred place and something inside you stirred for no reason. Or maybe because you saw something too, something you couldn't explain, and chose to bury it in silence. You're not alone. And if someday, as you walk down an empty street, you hear footsteps that aren't yours, or if a cold wind brushes your neck when everything else is still Don't run, don't scream, stop, listen. And remember that sometimes all those souls are looking for is someone to see them and say, I see you, I know you were here. Because sometimes death isn't the end. It's just the last time someone waits to be named.